Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Strategy Gap. We had a fun one in store. It's going to be Joe and I just talking all things strategy. And today's topic will be really delving into the topic of brainstorming and how to involve that in your strategic planning process. Certainly, this time of the year, whether we're gearing up for the next year of planning or we're midway through the year. Now, as where ideas are flowing, we're trying to figure out how to incorporate that into your strategy. But before we do so, I figure it's been a while, particularly for some of our new listeners that maybe don't know a little bit more about Joe and I's background. So, Joe, you want to kick things off with a little bit of your background and kind of what makes you qualified to talk on this subject?
Yes, my favorite topic. Ultimately, been at Achiever for about 11 years, and I've since being here have always worked with clients in the strategy development and execution space. So I've been doing that for, like I said, 11 years, and we're talking hundreds of engagements over that time in pretty much every industry. All of my extra money has gone to higher education as well. So I have an MBA from Rutgers with a focus in strategy. I have a master's in science from Boston University in healthcare communication that was really centered on health literacy, strategic planning, and a variety of other topics. Prior to AchieveIt, I worked at a large pharmaceutical company. I did a bunch of rotations in sales, marketing, global speaker management, project management, you name it. So my goal is to just bring that experience to this podcast and just look at things from an objective perspective. And it only works because I do have a partner with similar experience. And Jonathan, why don't you take a moment to go through your background as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, joined Achieve It, I guess, 7.5 years now as a strategy consultant with Joe. And throughout that time, I spent a variety of years working with customers and organizations on their strategic planning and strategy execution processes. Currently, head up revenue operations, which is its own area of strategy and operations, as well as marketing. And both at Achieve It and in previous roles, I've often kind of been that person that wears multiple different hats. And in that process, it's a lot of problem solving, a lot of figuring out we're at a pivot point. How do we ideate, come up with ideas, move them into a formal process, and then actually execute them beyond that? So, looking forward to the conversation as well. And I guess really to kick things off a little bit more than the lead in, uh, Joe, this is going to be no new news for you, but for most organizations, right, we're at a pivot point in the middle of the year right now, coming into June timeframe where companies are either at the middle of their year or maybe they're coming up to the end of their fiscal year. And everybody loves the time when either you've hit a problem or you need some new ideas, or the best scenario is when people come back from conferences with all these great ideas. And people love brainstorming, they love these ideas, but people kind of don't really know how to figure out, okay, what do we do now? Like we have this plan, we're building our plan. How do we best incorporate these ideas into something that we can actually execute for our organization? So we're going to talk about this today, how to turn it into a strategy, how to make these decisions. But as we kick things off, I wanted to get your general thoughts on the topic, Joe.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a couple camps that I see people fall into. So obviously I speak to a lot of customers, but also in my role, I speak to a lot of folks that are examining Achieve It. So you have a blend of perspectives there. And you have people that maybe haven't really done anything that resembles brainstorming for a while because they've been so heads down with COVID. And then at that point, they're like, well, we've been doing well without a plan since COVID. So what do we need one for now? And then all of a sudden the turbulence appears, and now they're like, we gotta get serious. So I've seen that. I've seen people who've done it before, where they've done a brainstorming session. They don't really think it's that great of a concept because nothing came of it. A lot of people have PTSD from going into a conference room for 2 days. Probably an outside consultant came in and then never hear about it again. And so some people are a little bit scared of going down that path again. And then you have the outliers, the ones that are typically pretty good at this, where they'll get in a room, they'll come up with some ideas and refine it down to a plan. I'd say it's a little bit more rare than it should be, just because I think there's this weird concept of thinking of big ideas is thought of as a higher level activity, and figuring out how to do it is seemed to be less than. I can't disagree more. When it comes to business, you have to have people that know how to do both in the room. But sometimes the people that created the ideas, maybe at a higher level in the organization, say, well, I've done my part. Good luck to you. Make a plan. That doesn't work. And so we're going to talk through some ways to really easily fix that, because the issue is them leaving the room. How about you don't leave the room? But that's normally what I see. And so you've done a similar role to what I've been doing for a long time. It's been a few years, but those memories last a lifetime. What did you see during your time as a strategy consultant, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think I agree with you for most of the aspects. I think where people tend to struggle more is, how do we incorporate this within our process, right? It's we've come up with all of these ideas. We've said, hey, this we've got the approval from the board. We've rolled it out to the team, and now something has changed, or things are going not the way it was intended to go or anticipated to go, and you're trying to figure out what do we do now, or someone has a new idea, how do we incorporate that? So that's, people definitely have their own struggles, and organizations have their own struggles in creating the plan, but I find most of the time it's how do we now deviate from this process and actually incorporate new ideas or adjustments to the ideas, because it seems like this very difficult process to then change everything. So I guess maybe I'll kick it off there to you is, thinking about the strategic planning process. When should people incorporate brainstorming and ideation? Is it something that's only happening at the beginning, in your opinion? Is it happening throughout? Is it only at certain inflection points? When do you see successful organizations leverage it?
I think it has to happen a little bit earlier than people think it might need to happen. So if we're thinking the end of the calendar year, let's just keep the most basic example. You probably want to start this in the October timeframe, in order to get some ideas on the table. Because as I've stated multiple times in this podcast, and I probably said it 14 times this week to clients, is that your strategic plan just can't be a collection of good ideas. So brainstorming sometimes lends itself to the idea that every idea is a good one, and therefore if you bring it up in the meeting, it's going to make it into the plan. Can't happen that way, but you have to start with something. So in a perfect world, if you have anything more than 6 focus areas, it gets me a little bit nervous. It gives me agita. So the idea of you going into a room and only coming out with 6 focus areas is pretty slim. You're probably going to come out with 16. So that's why starting in October, or even a little bit, you can start a little later than that, gives you an opportunity to whittle down that list from 16 down to 4 to 6. That's ideal, but that's the hardest part. And a lot of people either don't do that and keep all 16 in there, or they cut it to the bone and all the ideas are thrown out and no one's happy. So you have to really figure out how you can take the ideas that are coming in and gently say to folks that, yes, idea number 17 was fantastic, but it's not going to make the cut this year because of these reasons. And you have to just be very real. I mean, the idea of the old triple constraint with quality, price, and time. One or more things are going to be impacted by impacting the other. And we don't have the ability to execute 16 broad sweeping strategies this year. It is something that's not possible. So something has to be cut. And if people come into the room with the mindset that their idea may not be chosen, that doesn't mean they're a bad person or the idea was bad, but it doesn't fit into whatever parameters we have for the year. That's a productive brainstorming session. If it's just, let's just get on the whiteboard and put some sticky notes up, that sets the wrong tone. So something in the middle, as you always see me say, very right down the middle. Do a brainstorming session, but set good guardrails on it to let everybody know what they should expect afterwards.
Yeah, and I think, the mistake that you're mentioning is that you're letting bad ideas become or good ideas become failure of poor timing, right? It's not necessarily a bad idea, just maybe not right now, and making sure you don't forget about that for the future. Yeah, I think in my perspective, when you think about the strategic planning process, I don't know that brainstorming should only happen at certain stages, right? It's not only just something that happens in the planning phase, or only something that happens at a quarterly basis or an annual basis, or whatever that pivot point is in your planning life cycle. For me, there should be different scales of that process, right? You've got a more formal setting for when you're actually developing the plan, but there needs to be abbreviated versions and an opportunity for that brainstorming to happen in situations where maybe one of your key priorities that you expected to really move the needle on one of the focus areas is off track midway through the year. Well, you can't go back and recreate your entire plan, but there needs to be some way to facilitate a process to generate new ideas, as opposed to just throwing resources at it and not thinking about how do we actually fix this while maintaining the semblance of our original plan.
It's interesting you say that, because I mean, brainstorming, we're talking about it happening under happy conditions. A lot of times brainstorming happens when something is going sideways. Best example of this would be Starbucks had a huge quarterly miss in earnings last week, and the CEO went on CNBC and just got pretty much roasted by the morning, the squawk on the street folks. So they had three different reporters just really hammering the CEO on their plans because they missed on pretty much every single category. They're losing share, they're losing sales, revenue's down, and their competitors are up. So the CEO said multiple times, and you can tell he was somewhat media trained. We got together and we have an action plan, and that action plan is to bring more value to the consumer. Give them more things that they want. And he get rattled off like four things that you can tell came through a brainstorming
Yeah,
session.
the PR team had an action plan, probably.
100%. And then the reporters were like, well, everything you're mentioning doesn't actually impact what everybody sees when they walk into a store because they have eyeballs, that there's 1,000 mobile orders and that its stores are messy and there's no place to sit anymore and all the bathrooms are locked. These are the things that are probably impacting your sales more than any of the things that you mentioned. So sometimes the brainstorming sessions also have to have a little pinch of reality in there as well, where if anybody was in the boardroom with those executives at Starbucks, they would tell you, in the last week, I went to Starbucks and here are the 5 things that I saw that turned me off and I won't be back. That should lead you. So the information you have going into your brainstorming session is equally as critical as what you actually come up with in the meeting. Because if it's not based in reality, then what's the point?
Yeah, funny enough, the other day I was reading 2 articles about brainstorming, right? One from the Harvard Business Review, uh, duly titled "Why Group Brainstorming is a Waste of Time," and another one, Wall Street Journal, "Office Brainstorms Are a Waste of Time."
Oh
So
boy,
probably one
cancel
influenced
the
the other,
podcast.
but
Can't
yeah,
do it.
it's I think there's a perception out there that, to your point earlier, brainstorming is just throwing sticky notes on a whiteboard, and it's a waste of time. And I think there are some valid reasons in these articles about why they're not not helpful for an organization, right? Because of social loafing or social anxiety and getting your ideas out there, regression to the mean, kind of preventing you from getting your own ideas out there yourself. But I think most people that are listening to this podcast, maybe they have their different perspectives on brainstorming, but they're going to need to generate ideas in some way, shape, or form. So when you work with organizations or when you've sat in a room with organizations that's doing this effectively, how do they facilitate that brainstorming or ideation process to ultimately get the most out of those that are listening or involved in that conversation?
Yeah, there's a little bit of bias built into my answer because we have a couple services that we offer. That my department has 3 different workshops that we offer, and one is oddly enough called plan facilitation. And we as a company made the decision a while back that we aren't going to be the company that comes in and does a lot of this sticky note sessions and let's do pestle analysis and SWOT analysis and stakeholder interviews and all the stuff that you read in business school is imperative. I'm not necessarily knocking the value of some of those things, but ultimately those are things that typically could be better run by the organization themselves. And what we tell our clients, especially when they're coming on board, is that as long as you have a general sense of your focus areas, someone like myself or someone on my team can then help you flesh out that plan. If you have nothing and it's just complete white space, then call us back later when you have that, because ultimately they're the ones that need to come up with that. Because it's going to be, unless you're one of the largest consulting firms in the world that has expertise, and even there's some gaps. Ultimately, the ideas about what needs to be fixed are going to come from the people, hopefully internally. And so what we do is we say, okay, if you have your 4 to 5 or 6 focus areas, let's come into a room and take those. Let's stress test them. Let's not take them at face value. We might take away one, we might add one, whatever it may look like. And then we're going to build a hierarchy out of every single part of the plan underneath that. And that usually takes the form of some sort of a goal statement for each of the focus areas, aka what does good look like? There's then a level below that with some KPIs. So how are we going to measure if we've achieved the goal? And then last but not least, what initiatives are we going to work on to impact those KPIs? And as long as that structure is there to say, we are here to fill out the plan and flesh it out and do all the things that need to be done, it usually sets a decent tone for the people involved because there is a deliverable by the end of the engagement. And our engagements usually last about a day. A full day, a very robust day, but the end of the day, there is something they can look at and say, this didn't exist at 9 a.m. It does exist at 4, and I'm bought in because this is not like other processes we went through, which is I sat in this room and nothing happened afterwards. And so, if you're going to do this right, you have to make sure that there's something that is tangible that the team can really can feel and see. And that tangible thing should be a strategic plan. Maybe you can't get it done that day. That sometimes is ambitious if you don't bring someone in, but it has to be within a week or two after completing the final session. It can't be months, or sometimes I've even 6 months to 8 months. It's impossible, and you're going to lose your entire team.
I think that those are all valid points in turning it into a plan. One thing that I can maybe speak for myself on how I do it with my own team and how I've seen it, and this is obviously inspired by other organizations, but I do think there's validity in the fact that when you're in a brainstorming session, people are going to be nervous about presenting their ideas, right? Nobody wants to be the one that is it's implied that it's an idiotic idea, or they get a bunch of looks, or they see people messaging each other or texting each other during the meeting, and it's that's going to shut down the rest of the group. Part of that's a culture thing, right? You have to have a culture that enables that. But what I found to be successful is before the session where you're actually in there with the group, right? Ask those that are involved in the conversation to go and brainstorm on their own by themselves. Let them come up with their own ideas, and then the group portion of that conversation is sharing those ideas and iterating upon those. It's not, okay, we're going to walk into a room and now this is the first time we've ever even talked about brainstorming for this particular idea. You're essentially giving people homework ahead of time. So that's enabling to flush out all these ideas, and then we can build upon those in person together. Once you have a culture that supports that, then I find that people are open to sharing their ideas. You go about it in a methodical order where people are not embarrassed to say those ideas. We're just building on them and working together through those. And then at the end of that process, kind of going through, which we'll talk about in a little bit, cutting through those ideas to ultimately build it into your plan.
Yeah, it has to be. The ideas have to be more than just because consultants get there's a lot of consulting jokes out there. But the one is like they come in, they look at the business and say, "You need to increase revenue and decrease costs." Like, give me my money. Like the ideas have to be rooted in some sort of metric, and a lot of times those metrics can be rooted in more money, less expense. But there has to be some real true understanding from the people closest to the work about what are the real problems facing this organization and preventing our ability to scale and grow the way we expect, and let's actually tackle those things. So to your point, there are some topics that might be taboo, where there might be a service line that is not performing at the level it needs to be, but it was the idea of the CEO. So therefore, no one's going to bring up the fact that that needs to be fixed. That those types of things are probably a topic for another podcast, but it is something to consider. And what
Yeah.
Jonathan's recommending is a good one, which is pre-work. You can't have people come into these meetings cold. Sometimes that people say, "I want you to come in cold." I don't believe that's makes sense at all. Put some thought into your ideas. Do some research. Doesn't need to be fully fleshed out, but on our team, we do a thing every quarter where everybody on the customer engagement team takes on different projects to improve the experience for the team or the customer. We have one session where we ideate all the different topics that are the projects that we might work on, and then we poke holes in it. Everybody on the team goes, "What about this? What about that? Don't we already have something that does that? Oh, I didn't know." And then they have about a week to then take whatever's left over, do a scoping plan, and see if it still makes sense. And after a week, if they determine that it still makes sense, they'll move forward. And then if they decide it doesn't make sense, no hard feelings. There's no any sort of social score lost on that. They're able to kind of back out based on their research. So that type of thing really has helped us kind of bring the walls down a bit and not have the pressure of having every idea fully baked out in a meeting. But 1 week later, if you truly are committed to it, I want you to have it fully baked out. And here's a form you're going to fill out, and that's going to determine what you're doing. So that if you're struggling, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, and I think people naturally are afraid of their ideas, or their team being afraid that their ideas are going to be those idiotic ones, or ones that are, sometimes laughed out of the room. I saw an interesting quote on this topic. It says, in brainstorming sessions, about 70% of the ideas could be considered idiotic or not good for the team.
It's higher than I
But
thought.
that's a fair price to pay for the 30% that are actually going to help the organization. So I think going into it with that perspective is like, yes, there are going to be ideas that are outlandish or may not work, but we need to feel comfortable presenting all of those, because that's going to get us to the 30% that is going to work. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to find.
Well, I mean, a lot of these books that are out there helping people build their plans aren't really helping. So, I mean, I'm not going to disparage the idea of a BHAG, big, hairy,
No.
audacious goals. Like, there's books out there that help you think that way. Think these ways. These are the ways that are going to solve the world, solve all the world's problems. All your company problems will be solved. And a lot of times, the smaller things are what make improvements. So, yes, there are going to be some big ideas in your plan, but sometimes there's small things, and if you add them all up, it becomes big. So, also framing up the brainstorming session that not every idea has to be a home run. If we get a bunch of singles and
Mm-hmm.
doubles, then all of a sudden we now are going. And I've been to brainstorming sessions where blue sky only. And if you bring up anything that's like less than, more kind of tactical, you're seen as less than, and therefore kind of ostracized a bit. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of expectation setting beforehand. And also, if you have to know yourself, if you're facilitating the meeting as a leader in the organization and your tendency is to get mad at bad ideas, then practice your poker face in the mirror and figure out how to not have that happen and really be conscious about it, because people will pick up on your cues. I've been to sessions before where somebody says an idea and they all lock eyes on the person across the room that really is in charge to see what they think. If that's happening, you have to really swat it down, because otherwise, what's the point? If all the ideas are funneling through that person across the room that everyone keeps looking at before they talk, then there's something wrong. So really scan the room and see if people are being their authentic self. If so, you've done a good job. If not, keep working at it. It comes with time. But the moment you revert to old behavior, all that progress is lost.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not going to get mad at stupid ideas and you're 8 hours into the meeting and one idea just sets you off and you're like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, then all that goodwill is lost. So it might be an
Yeah.
extreme example, but you
And
get
for
what I mean.
future meetings too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, don't do it at the beginning, the end, the middle. Ultimately, just challenge yourself to be different if you truly want to see a difference in the culture in your organization.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about this ideation process. Very important for getting them on the table. But I think the main portion of this conversation moving forward is we've got the ideas. Now what? How do we make sure it's not just an idea? How do we make sure we formulate it into an initiative or an entire plan or adjust our plan? You talked about it a little bit around that framework of kind of breaking down the different aspects of the plan based on this ideation process. Maybe let's dive into that a little bit deeper. What are the components that you focus on when you're going from the idea to execution phase?
Yeah. So the focus areas, that's the thing too, is like at least I try to guide our clients in a way that they pick language that's pragmatic. Because you pick up a strategy textbook, you're seeing pillars of light, all sorts of odd names for the top. And the pillar thing comes from those old illustrations of a Greek temple, and you have Corinthian columns, and okay, those are fine, but like it doesn't really resonate with today. Just areas of focus make sense to me as your top level, because it just sounds great if you're at a party and someone says, "What are you focused on?" Well, I'm focused on these three things. So you have to have a number of those at the top of your plan, and anything more than six is a problem. Anything less than six is typically pretty good. Then you have to have some statement, a sentence or two of what good looks like. So if your focus area is customer service, then you better have some example of what the promised land looks like. So how do we actually know we're better? Maybe it's I want to win an award in that particular area. There's an award given to your industry for the top customer service organizations based on their excellence in the field. That could be a goal that you're striving for. And then below that, you got to have some ways to measure it. So the reason why we didn't get the award last year was because our time to connection was too long. When people call our organization, it takes 8 minutes before somebody picks up the line. We got to get that down to 30 seconds. Like those types of things, those root causes need to be in your plan very nicely and succinctly. We're talking hopefully 2 to 3 areas that are really causing you pain. If there's anything more than that, you might need to split it out. And then below that, if your time to connection is too long, then what are you doing to fix it? Have those initiatives below it. Sounds simple. I promise. Like, well, Joe, this is basic stuff. I promise you, it is not. When people get into the strategic planning mode, they start getting creative and getting a little bit more complicated. And we're keeping it very simple. What are we focused on? How do we know we've succeeded in the area? How are we going to measure it? And what are we going to do to impact those measures? And that way, everybody knows exactly if they're hanging out down here, I'm doing this to impact this number. This number is going to allow us to accomplish our goal. This goal is important because we're focused on customer experience, whatever it may be. So having a simple 4-level, 5-level plan is a good start. Make the levels in your plan very succinct, have good definitions, and then just use that throughout the day. And before you know it, the first swim lane, the first focus area is going to probably take more time than you think. You're going to be like, God, we're never going to get done. But then you realize then after that, they exercise that muscle. The second, third, fourth, fifth swim lane go by much, much quicker. So that's my recommendation. That's what I've seen work. And that's the only way that you're at the end of the day going to actually have a deliverable. Otherwise, it's going to be, all right, I guess we'll pick this up next time. And then the next time it's going to be, oh, I guess we'll pick this up next time. And it's going to be in perpetuity. You have to have finality in your strategic planning process for once.
Yeah, and I hate to use buzzwords, but the key in that piece is making sure there's true alignment in the plan and across the organization for what you're doing. I think we've both seen plans and organizations where, and maybe some listeners fall into this boat, where you've got all these metrics that you're tracking, and then you've got all this work that you're tracking, and maybe it's all important, but those that are actually doing it don't actually know what it's driving at the end. It's like, well, it kind of impacts that over there, and it kind of impacts this metric over here. But I'm also working on a lot of this work that's not really doing anything related to these initiatives or KPIs or goals. And that maybe is okay in some cultures, but as you begin to scale up a lot of these processes and projects and KPIs, you're going to start getting individuals where it seeps into their brain. It's like, well, hold on a second. You're asking me to do all these things, but then you're also telling me these goals over here are important. What you're trying to get me to do does not touch those goals whatsoever. So why am I going to waste my time doing that, particularly in a case where it impacts my own compensation or bonuses or my own performance? You don't want to have a situation where people are choosing what to do and what not to do based on alignment as opposed to having everything properly aligned. So and that's an important piece. Like one thing I'll add on to what you mentioned is that, you know, outside of the core planning piece, when you're thinking about maybe just an individual idea, right, midway through the year or a new idea you're trying to incorporate in, I think the SMART framework is a very good one that people often forget. Everybody's heard the acronym for SMART goals and SMART initiatives and making sure that everything's specific and measurable. The A is actionable. The R is it's results focused and a goal related to it. And then T, the timely component. Everybody knows it, but so many organizations forget that on an individual level. They kind of have it in different components, right? This project's gonna run this time, and this goal is going to be measurable, but they're not all. Each individual initiative or each individual idea isn't smart, and that's what often causes that problem for moving into execution.
Yeah, you brought up another good topic for another future podcast is how to align strategic plans with incentives, because that's been a major problem
Yeah.
with corporate America. You hear a lot like if CEOs are tied to stock price, then they're going to do things that are going to impact the stock price. That might be share buybacks, things like that, that have a direct impact on share price. They don't necessarily do much to enhance the customer experience or to create shareholder value. It's just doing a short term thing for a short term gain, which is aligned to their incentives. So that's an interesting point you make up. And then to your other point, yeah, the plan has to be reflective of your true problems. Not to bring up Starbucks again, but the big thing there is mobile orders. So if you're a barista and you're like, the working conditions here stink because I'm making 1,000 frappuccinos a day, which is not too far off. And there's nothing in your 5-point plan to solve the crisis of the company that involves mobile orders, then that disconnect can cause that person to shut off completely for the rest of the plan. So the elephant in the room, the biggest problem in your organization, has to show up in the plan at some point. Otherwise, it's delusional. And secondarily, nobody's going to pay attention to the plan. They're going to like, this isn't a serious document. You're not even talking about the two things that if you walked in the door, from Jump Street that are a problem. So make sure you do a little. That's why you have to have the right people in the room for these brainstorming sessions. You can't just have 3 or 4 people that are in the proverbial ivory tower of your organization. You have to have people that have boots on the ground that see what's happening. I've seen some organizations bring somebody in that maybe has never been in a boardroom in their life, but they're there to really bring some levity to the conversation and check some assumptions. That's a big thing. So don't go into it thinking you already know the answer. Brainstorming should hopefully lead you to an answer based on organic conversation from various viewpoints. If you walk in with this and you come out with the same answer you thought you're going to come out with, then something's up, and that probably means you had the wrong people in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I think one last thing before we close out is people, when you come up with these ideas, you build your plan, um, they forget about the fact that they have to make choices, right? You can't just continue to add and add and add. So, quickly, in your perspective, what do you see successful organizations do to make those decisions on what to do and what not to do?
Yeah, ultimately, an idea in a room is fine, but then somebody has to, like I mentioned earlier, go out and actually test it to see, well, how much is actually going to cost us, and do we have the right staff to do this? Like, this sounds great, but we don't. We only have 5 engineers that know that language, and we can't get that done in that time frame. Otherwise, we're going to have to hire people. Oh, we don't have the budget to hire people. So start doing some stress tests, and that should lead you to what you can do and not do. Not to say that every hard thing that you come up with that you say, well, this is going to be hard, don't do it. It's just that you have to be realistic. If you have 5 ideas and all 5 are extremely 10 out of 10 difficult, then maybe 3 of them need to go. And it all comes down to which is going to have the biggest impact on the metric that is the most detrimental to the company at this present time. So if your market share is suffering, then you're going to have a certain set of strategies that you might employ. And so ultimately the goal is to figure out which one's going to have the biggest impact. And the way you can figure that out is to say, if this project or initiative that I'm putting into the plan, let's say it gets done perfectly, on time, on budget, it wins awards for its amazingness. Which metric downstream will it impact directly? And if it's a metric that's big enough, one that is keeping you up at night, it probably belongs in the plan. If the answer is some small thing, or worse yet, I don't actually know, I just think we're doing this to do it, those are the ones that immediately need to be thrown out of the plan. So that's not the perfect answer. There's more nuance to it, but that's a good start.
Yeah, I find also that there are organizations that do this extremely well, right? Every single initiative has to have a full ROI process and an investment committee involved. That's fantastic. That's not how a lot of organizations operate. They don't have the insights or the knowledge, or it's not as concrete of an idea that they can actually go through that process. So in those cases, I think what's helpful is balancing multiple different ways to prioritize. So it's looking at things like you mentioned. It's what is the expected impact of this, whether that's revenue or customer satisfaction or whatever the case may be. What is the perceived effort that this is going to take, and then balancing that with something like the Eisenhower matrix, right?
Mm.
For those not familiar with the Eisenhower matrix, it's a lovely 2x2 for all the consultants out there, where on the x-axis you've got urgency, and on the y-axis you've got importance. And so if something is urgent and important, you're going to do it, right? That's something you're going to do right away. If something is important but not urgent, that's something you want to schedule out for a time in the year or a time in your planning cycle where there's resources for that. If something is not important but it's urgent, well, you maybe want to delegate that. You want to delegate that to a different team or a different individual that has the bandwidth to do that. And then most importantly, when things fall into that not urgent and not important category, those are the things you don't want to do. You want to minimize those, you want to cut them from the plan. And so as you go through an idea, put it through that process, but also look at the existing ideas you already have on the table. Maybe things have changed throughout the year. Maybe things can be reprioritized or moved into a different quadrant, that then opens up some of that space for additional ideas and additional work throughout the course of the year.
That means the Eisenhower matrix has been around for a long time, since President Eisenhower, for a reason, because it is a good way to check yourself and understand if you truly are thinking about a problem in the right way. So couldn't recommend it enough. Quick Google, you'll have it, print it out, put it on your wall. It does help you make decisions, even in your personal life. It's not a bad thing when it's a Saturday and you have about 45 things to do. You can use it to kind of whittle down the list.
Yeah, absolutely. Personal life too, absolutely. Well, Joe, it was a fun conversation today. Hopefully, this information is timely for those that are either mid-year or coming up on their planning cycle and going through the fun process of brainstorming and cutting ideas or building ideas. And looking forward to more fun conversations like this in the future.
Absolutely. And just know that if you are stuck and you need some help, we're always here to help as well. So just, this is our area of expertise when it comes to helping you build out your plan. So if that's something you're interested in, you know where to find us. Go to achieveit.com.